Imagine walking through a dense, swampy forest 300 million years ago. The air is thick, hot, and heavy with humidity. Giant club mosses and towering horsetails stretch 100 feet into the sky, blotting out the sun. Suddenly, a shadow passes over you, accompanied by a deafening low-frequency hum. But this is not a bird. It is Meganeura, a predatory dragonfly with a wingspan stretching over 2.5 feet, the size of a modern eagle. Welcome to the Carboniferous period, an extraordinary era in Earth's history when bugs ruled the planet and grew to nightmarish, monstrous proportions. We are not just talking about giant dragonflies. During this time, millipedes grew as long as small cars, and scorpions reached the size of domestic dogs. For tens of millions of years, these arthropods were the true titans of the land and air. But how did the laws of physics and biology allow these creatures to shatter the strict size limits we see today? What environmental secrets unlocked this golden age of giants, and why did it ultimately come to a crashing end? Today, we will explore why insects became true giants during the Carboniferous period. We will decode the biological paradoxes, the atmospheric anomalies, and the evolutionary arms race that created these spectacular prehistoric titans. If you enjoy this deep dive into prehistoric science, please like and subscribe to the channel for more immersive journeys into deep time. Also, please leave a comment below letting us know exactly where and when you're watching this video from around the world. Let us step into the ancient past and unlock the secrets of the world of giant insects. The story of prehistoric giants does not begin with a biological mutation, but with the slow, titanic movements of the earth beneath our feet. To understand how insects reached such monstrous proportions, we must first trace the dramatic geological shifts that reshape the planet during the Carboniferous period, starting roughly 359 million years ago. During this era, the map of the world looked radically different than it does today. The familiar continents we know were caught in a slow-motion collision course, driven by the immense heat and convective currents deep within the mantle of the Earth. Before this grand unification, the land masses were scattered across the globe as isolated fragments. However, tectonic forces were steadily pushing these massive land masses together. The two great supercontinents of the time, Euramerica and Gondwana, were actively grinding against one another, closing ancient oceans and thrusting up massive mountain ranges, such as the early Appalachian chain. This monumental crunching of tectonic plates eventually culminated in the assembly of a singular massive supercontinent known as Pangaea. The formation of this megaland mass drastically altered the global climate, oceanic currents, and atmospheric patterns, setting the stage for an unprecedented ecological boom. As these giant land masses merged near the equator, the geography created a perfect storm for a specific kind of environment. Because the vast interior of the newly forming supercontinent was surrounded by shallow, warm seas, the equatorial zones experienced immense levels of rainfall. The coastal regions and low-lying basins became trapped in a cycle of perpetual warmth and flooding. Water had nowhere to drain efficiently, creating vast, interconnected basins that remained permanently waterlogged. This unique combination of tectonic placement and heavy precipitation birthed the extensive, globe-spanning equatorial wetlands known historically as the Great Carboniferous Coal Swamps. These were not mere swamps in the modern sense. They were massive, structural ecosystems that stretched for thousands of miles across what is now North America, Europe, and Asia. In these waterlogged soils, standard decomposition cycles ground to a halt. The sheer scale of these wetlands was heavily reinforced by the flat, low-lying topography generated by the colliding tectonic plates. Ocean levels fluctuated wildly due to massive glaciations occurring at the southern pole of Gondwana, causing the seas to repeatedly flood and recede across the lowlands. Every time the sea levels rose, they deposited thick layers of marine sediments over the coastal forests, trapping organic matter underneath and preventing it from rotting away. The creation of Pangaea essentially acted as a giant cradle for this swamp ecosystem. The equatorial position ensured that these vast wetlands never experienced a true winter, enjoying a continuous growing season with maximum solar radiation. The environment was incredibly stable for millions of years, allowing specialized plant life to diversify and conquer every square inch of available mud and water. The endless expanses of shallow water prevented heavy erosion, locking the landscape into a permanent, highly productive state. The geology of the planet had essentially constructed a giant humid greenhouse, a massive incubator designed to fuel an explosion of life. Without this specific tectonic configuration, the massive coal swamps could never have reached the global scale required to alter the chemistry of the planet. The collision of the continents did not just move mountains, it fundamentally broke the normal carbon recycling system of the world. By trapping trillions of tons of water and organic matter in stagnant, low-oxygen basins across the equator, plate tectonics laid the literal and chemical foundation for the bizarre atmosphere that followed. It was within these endless, warm, flooded labyrinths of the early Pangaean supercontinent that the ancestors of modern insects found a home devoid of modern limitations, allowing them to begin their evolutionary journey toward becoming the undisputed giants of the ancient world. The global climate of the Carboniferous period was defined by an extreme greenhouse state that transformed the equatorial belt of Pangaea into a planetary engine of pure biological production. The thermal profile of the Earth during this epoch was intensely uniform across the lower latitudes, characterized by a crushing humidity and temperatures that rarely fluctuated. The ocean's evaporation rates were staggeringly high, pumping immense volumes of moisture directly into the troposphere. This created a dense, permanent cloud cover that hung over the landscape, trapping thermal radiation from the sun and locking the planet into a feedback loop of perpetual heat and moisture. This ancient greenhouse effect was initially driven by significant concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide, which insulated the planet and prevented solar heat from radiating back into space. The air was heavy, thick, and highly saturated with water vapor, creating a climate that resembled a global sauna. In this hyper-productive atmosphere, seasons as we know them vanished near the equator. There were no frost cycles, no prolonged droughts, and no periods of vegetative dormancy. Instead, the world experienced an endless growing season, powered by maximum solar radiation, consistent cloud-filtered light, and near-daily torrential downpours that replenished the massive waterlogged basins. Underneath this thick, humid blanket, the plant kingdom underwent a spectacular explosion in size and diversity, pioneering structural designs never seen before on land. Because the soil was a permanent semi-aquatic slurry, plants did not face the danger of dehydration that limits modern vegetation. Instead, they raced upward to capture the sunlight filtered through the heavy clouds. The landscapes were dominated not by modern flowering trees, but by giant spore-bearing plants that grew to the height of modern skyscrapers. Among the most prominent were the lepidodendrales, commonly known as scale trees. These plants were botanical monsters, reaching heights of over 130 feet with trunks over 6 feet in diameter, covered in a scaly pattern of leaf scars. Alongside these towering scale trees grew the Sigillaria, another lineage of massive club mosses that split into heavy, fork-like branches topped with clusters of long grass-like leaves. The understory of these forests was choked with calamites, which were ancestral relative to modern horsetails, but grew as thick, segmented, bamboo-like trees that reached 30 feet into the humid air. Carpeted beneath these botanical titans were dense layers of ancient ferns and seed ferns, which thrived in the deep shade of the swamp canopy. The sheer density of this flora was unprecedented. Trees grew packed tightly together, their root systems interlocking in the deep mud, forming an impenetrable wall of green that covered millions of square miles. This green explosion created an unprecedented biological engine. Every square mile of these giant forests was operating at maximum photosynthetic efficiency. absorbing vast amounts of solar energy and processing nutrients at a rate that has never been matched in Earth history. The global canopy acted as a massive planetary lung, churning through carbon compounds and altering the very fabric of the environment. The sheer volume of organic matter generated by these fast-growing spore-bearing giants meant that the forest floor was constantly piled deep with fallen trunks, branches and leaves, accumulating faster than the landscape could process them. The extreme climate and the explosion of giant flora were perfectly intertwined. The high heat and humidity catalyzed rapid plant growth, while the massive volume of vegetation altered regional weather patterns, causing localized transpiration loops that produced even more rainfall. This continuous cycle converted the entire equatorial zone of the supercontinent into a self-sustaining botanical empire. It was a world of green saturation, where the atmosphere was constantly thick with falling spores, the smell of stagnant water, and the heavy mist of the prehistoric greenhouse. This colossal botanical machinery did not just change the appearance of the land, it was actively manipulating the chemical balance of the entire globe. By consuming enormous volumes of nutrients and locking them into towering wooden structures, these giant forests began to strip components from the atmosphere, setting the stage for a dramatic shift in air composition. The extreme climate had created the vegetation, and the vegetation was now poised to rewrite the rules of planetary chemistry. It was within this suffocatingly dense, hyperheated paradise of giant plants that the earliest land-dwelling arthropods found themselves surrounded by an infinite supply of shelter and energy, completely insulated from the harsh realities of the outer world. The explosion of the massive Carboniferous forests was driven by a revolutionary biological innovation that changed the structural properties of plant life forever. In the earlier eras of terrestrial life, plants were small, low-lying organisms confined to the edges of water sources because they lacked the physical strength to stand upright against gravity. However, as the competition for sunlight intensified, a major evolutionary breakthrough occurred with the development of advanced vascular tissues and the synthesis of a complex organic polymer known as lignin. This cellular compound transformed the botanical world by providing the rigidity and water transportation efficiency necessary for plants to ascend into the sky. Lignin was an evolutionary masterpiece of biochemistry. It was embedded into the secondary cell walls of vascular plants, cross-linking with cellulose and hemicellulose fibers to form an incredibly tough hydrophobic matrix. This chemical structure did not just allow plants to grow tall, it acted as a waterproof lining for the internal plumbing of the plant, enabling the efficient transport of water and dissolved minerals from the roots up to leaves located over 100 feet in the air. Furthermore, lignin was highly resistant to mechanical compression, transforming soft plant tissues into sturdy, resilient wood that could withstand the powerful winds and heavy downpours of the equatorial greenhouse. However, the rapid, widespread evolution of lignin introduced a profound chemical crisis to the planetary ecosystem, creating what scientists refer to as the lignin paradox. While vascular plants had successfully engineered a way to build massive wooden structures, the rest of the biological world was completely unprepared to handle this new material. For tens of millions of years, as the giant-scale trees, club mosses and ancestral horsetails grew, died, and crashed to the swamp floor, their wooden trunks remained completely intact. The normal cycle of biological decomposition, which breaks down dead matter and returns its constituent elements to the soil and atmosphere, ground to a sudden and absolute halt. The reason for this ecological traffic jam lay in the limitations of the microscopic world. During the Carboniferous period, the specialized microorganisms responsible for modern decomposition simply did not exist. Today, when a tree falls in a forest, specific types of fungi, known colloquially as white rot fungi, secrete highly specialized enzymes called lignin peroxidases. These enzymes utilize oxygen chemistry to aggressively break apart the complex irregular chemical bonds of lignin, reducing the wood to soft mulch that bacteria can then easily consume. But during the Carboniferous era, these advanced lineages of wood-decaying fungi had not yet evolved their enzymatic toolkit. As a consequence of this evolutionary lag, the microscopic bacteria and primitive fungi that populated the warm, stagnant waters of the equatorial swamps were completely helpless against the fallen timber. They lacked the biochemical keys to unlock and dismantle the tough lignin armor wrapping the carbon-rich cells inside the wood. To these primitive decomposers, a fallen scale tree trunk was as indestructible as concrete or plastic. The dead trees could not rot, could not ferment, and could not be broken down into soil components. They simply accumulated where they fell, layer after layer, creating a subterranean vault of unyielding organic matter. This breakdown of the decomposition loop meant that the forest floors became massive structural graveyards. Millions of tons of ancient timber piled up in the shallow oxygen-poor waters of the swamps, creating dense mats of undecayed wood that grew deeper with each passing century. The stagnant acidic water further protected this accumulated biomass from any minor chemical weathering, sealing it away from the atmosphere. This massive bottleneck in the global carbon cycle meant that the building blocks of life were being extracted from the surface world and trapped in an ever-growing layer of indestructible organic debris, setting the stage for a total rearrangement of global chemistry. The consequences of the indestructible lignin armor extended far beyond the cluttered floors of the ancient equatorial swamps. Because the microscopic decomposers were completely powerless to break down the dead timber, the global carbon cycle was severed into two separate halves. Under normal planetary conditions, when a plant dies, microorganisms consume its tissues through cellular respiration, a process that absorbs oxygen from the air and releases carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. This balanced cycle ensures that atmospheric gases remain relatively stable over millions of years. However, during the Carboniferous period, this vital feedback loop collapsed entirely, triggering a massive chemical rearrangement of the entire planet, as millions of generations of giant-scale trees, towering horsetails and massive club mosses reached the end of their lifespans. They collapsed into the shallow, stagnant waters of the endless wetlands. Starved of oxygen and completely untouched by fungal decay, this staggering volume of unrotted wood was buried under its own immense weight. Over millions of years, tectonic subsidence and fluctuating sea levels deposited heavy layers of mud, sand, and marine sediments directly over these compressed mats of ancient vegetation. Under the crushing pressure and intense geothermal heat of the deep crust, the trapped wood underwent a profound geological transformation, slowly baking into the massive, dense veins of black coal that humans mine across the globe today. By compressing and burying this organic matter, the Earth was effectively acting as a permanent vault, locking away trillions of tons of carbon that had originally been extracted from the air. Under a balanced ecological system, that carbon should have been recombined with atmospheric oxygen through decay, forming carbon dioxide. Instead, because the carbon was safely sealed underground in the form of coal, the oxygen that had been generated by those plants during their lives was left completely unconsumed. The photosynthetic engines of the global forest were constantly splitting water molecules and pumping pure oxygen into the sky, while the primary mechanism that usually drained oxygen from the atmosphere was completely broken. With nothing to consume it, the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere began to rise at an unprecedented rate. Century after century, millennium after millennium, the air grew increasingly saturated with this highly reactive gas. In our modern world, oxygen makes up roughly 21% of the air we breathe, a level that supports life while keeping atmospheric reactivity relatively stable. But during the late Carboniferous period, this relentless accumulation drove atmospheric oxygen levels upward until they reached a staggering peak of approximately 35%. The planet had become a hyper-oxygenated pressure cooker, wrapped in an atmosphere that was nearly twice as rich in oxygen as the air of the modern era. This hyperoxic atmosphere fundamentally changed the physical behaviour of the environment. Air became noticeably denser, heavier, and more chemically volatile. Because oxygen is a powerful accelerator of combustion, the global climate experienced an era of intense wildfire activity. Lightning strikes from the frequent tropical storms ignited massive forest fires that could burn even through wet, humid swamp vegetation, leaving distinct layers of fossil charcoal within the geological record. Yet, despite these frequent infernos, the rapid growth rate of the giant forests and the continuous burial of unrotted wood ensured that the oxygen production line never faltered, maintaining this supercharged atmosphere for millions of years. For the living organisms of the Carboniferous period, this high oxygen atmosphere represented a profound environmental shift. Every breath, every cellular process, and every biological mechanism was now flooded with an abundance of metabolic fuel. For primitive animals moving through the dense undergrowth or flying through the thick canopy, the rules of energy production, stamina, and physical growth were completely rewritten. The atmosphere had become a playground of pure chemical energy, providing an unprecedented opportunity for any creature capable of adapting to its properties. It was this specific atmospheric miracle, born from the evolutionary failure of fungi and the creation of coal, that unlocked the biological constraints holding back the animal kingdom, clearing the path for the emergence of the true giants of the arthropod world. To understand how a 35% oxygen atmosphere transformed the animal kingdom, we must examine the unique and highly specialized anatomy of the creatures that benefited from it most. Unlike vertebrates, which rely on internal lungs and a complex cardiovascular network to distribute gases throughout their bodies, insects utilize a completely decentralized respiratory architecture known as the tracheal system. This anatomical design is highly efficient at small scales, but it operates under strict physical and structural rules that govern how large an organism can grow before its own biology turns against it. Instead of a centralized chest cavity that actively pumps air in and out, an insect features a series of external muscular valves called spiracles, arranged along the lateral sides of its abdomen and thorax. These spiracles act as the primary gateways to the external world, opening and closing to regulate the entry of fresh air and the exit of metabolic waste products while minimizing moisture loss. Once air passes through these external spiracles, it enters a vast microscopic labyrinth of internal tubes called tracheae. These primary tracheal trunks branch repeatedly into smaller and smaller pathways, mirroring the fractal distribution patterns seen in the root systems of trees or the blood vessels of mammals. As these tubes branch throughout the insect body, they eventually narrow into incredibly fine, fluid-filled structures called tracheoles, which measure less than 1 micrometer in diameter. These tracheoles penetrate so deeply into the organism that they make direct physical contact with individual cell membranes. This means that oxygen does not dissolve into a bloodstream to be carried around by hemoglobin or red blood cells. In fact, insect blood, known as hemolymph, plays almost no role in the transportation of respiratory gases. Its primary function is to distribute nutrients and immune cells. Instead, the tracheal system delivers oxygen directly from the outside air, straight to the metabolic engines of the muscles and organs. At small body sizes, this direct delivery architecture is an absolute marvel of biological efficiency. Because the gas does not have to be transferred across multiple cellular barriers into a circulatory fluid and then pumped by a heavy heart, insects can sustain remarkably high metabolic rates relative to their body mass. This explains how modern insects can fly, jump, and react with such explosive speed despite lacking complex internal organs. The entire system operates predominantly on passive gas mechanics, relying on the natural molecular movement of gases to keep the cells supplied with energy, while carrying away carbon dioxide. However, this anatomical simplicity introduces a massive structural vulnerability. Because the movement of oxygen through the microscopic tracheal tubes relies heavily on passive physical laws rather than a mechanical high-pressure pump like a vertebrate heart, the efficiency of the system decreases exponentially as the length of the tubes increases. For an insect to grow larger, its internal tracheal tubes must grow longer to reach the deeper tissues located further away from the external spiracles. In a standard modern atmosphere, this poses a fatal problem, as the gas molecules lose momentum and cannot travel deeply enough into a large body to prevent the innermost cells from suffocating. Therefore, the respiratory anatomy of an insect locks it into a strict geometric relationship with its environment. In our modern world, where the air is thin and contains only 21% oxygen, the maximum distance that gas can travel through passive structures before becoming completely depleted is severely limited. This anatomical constraint acts as an invisible ceiling, forcing modern insects to remain small, lightweight, and confined to low-volume body plans. But during the Carboniferous period, this exact same respiratory network, completely unchained from modern atmospheric limitations, became the ultimate superpower, allowing arthropods to bypass the structural bottlenecks that keep their modern descendants under our feet. The ultimate bottleneck governing insect size is rooted in the fundamental laws of physics, specifically the principles of passive gas diffusion. Within the microscopic network of an insect, the movement of oxygen is dictated by fixed laws of diffusion. This physical law states that the rate of diffusion of a gas through a medium is directly proportional to the concentration gradient of that gas and the surface area available, but inversely proportional to the distance the gas must travel. Because an insect relies on passive diffusion to move oxygen down its tracheal tubes, the gas must travel along a concentration gradient, moving naturally from areas of high pressure near the spiracles to areas of lower pressure inside the hard-working cells. At the microscopic scale of a typical modern insect, this gradient is sharp enough to drive oxygen molecules inward with immense speed. However, as an organism expands in physical size, a devastating geometric conflict emerges known as the square-cube law. When an animal doubles its linear dimensions, its external surface area increases by a factor of 4, but its internal volume and metabolic mass increase by a factor of 8. For an insect, this means that a larger body demands a vastly greater volume of oxygen to keep its expanding tissues alive. To meet this exponential spike in metabolic demand, the internal tracheal tubes must not only grow longer, but they must also widen significantly to accommodate a higher volume of airflow. This creates a severe structural crisis inside the body of a modern insect. Because the atmosphere of the modern world contains only 21% oxygen, the concentration gradient driving the gas down the tubes is relatively weak. To push enough oxygen through a longer tube to prevent inner cell suffocation, a giant modern insect would have to dedicate an unsustainable percentage of its internal volume purely to respiratory piping. Eventually, a physical tipping point is reached where the tracheal tubes would have to become so large and numerous that they would crowd out all other vital internal organs, including the digestive tract, reproductive systems, and structural muscles. Furthermore, passive diffusion is fundamentally limited by the speed at which individual gas molecules collide and drift through space. Over short distances measured in fractions of a millimeter, diffusion occurs almost instantly. But as the required travel distance increases into centimeters, the time required for oxygen to reach the end of a tracheal tube increases not linearly, but quadratically. In a modern 21% oxygen environment, if an insect grew to the size of a human, the air travelling through its passive breathing tubes would become completely depleted of oxygen, long before it ever reached the deep tissues, leaving the core of the animal to literally suffocate from within. Modern insects have attempted to overcome this limitation by using active abdominal pumping, compressing their main tracheal trunks to force air through the network. However, even with mechanical assistance, the low concentration of oxygen in modern air cannot provide enough partial pressure to sustain a giant body during critical life stages, such as after molting when the respiratory system is compressed and vulnerable. The 21% oxygen ceiling acts as a strict environmental barrier, locking modern insects into a small world where passive gas transport remains viable. It is a physical law that cannot be out-evolved. Under modern atmospheric conditions, biology is utterly defeated by physics, ensuring that the giant bugs of antiquity remain confined to the deep geological past. When the atmospheric concentration of oxygen soared to 35% during the late Carboniferous period, the physical laws governing insect respiration were dramatically rewritten. This hyperoxic environment completely transformed how the internal tracheal system operated, effectively dismantling the biological barriers that had previously kept arthropods small. With 35% oxygen, the partial pressure of the gas in the surrounding air was nearly twice as high as it is in the modern world. This immense pressure acted like an invisible supercharger, driving oxygen molecules through the external spiracles and deep into the internal network with unprecedented force. According to the laws of passive gas diffusion, the rate of molecular movement is directly tied to the steepness of the concentration gradient. Because the air outside the insect was saturated with such a massive concentration of oxygen, the gradient between the external atmosphere and the oxygen-depleted cells deep inside the body became incredibly steep. This extreme pressure differential allowed oxygen molecules to flood down the primary tracheal trunks and through the microscopic branching tracheoles at a speed never before achieved in animal history. The gas could travel vastly greater distances through passive structures before losing its kinetic momentum or becoming depleted by surrounding tissues. This chemical surplus triggered a profound anatomical reaction within the bodies of Carboniferous insects. In a modern atmosphere, insects must dedicate a large percentage of their internal volume to spacious tracheal piping just to capture enough oxygen to survive. However, in the hypersaturated air of the Carboniferous period, the extreme efficiency of gas transport meant that insects no longer required massive, bulky internal networks to satisfy their basic metabolic needs. Because every breath carried nearly double the amount of vital gas, the internal tracheal tubes could actually remain proportionally narrower and less dense, while still delivering an optimal supply of energy to the cells. This reduction in the required volume of respiratory plumbing solved the geometric crisis imposed by the square-cube law. Instead of the breathing tubes expanding to crowd out vital organs as body size increased, Carboniferous insects found themselves with a massive amount of newly available internal real estate. The spaces that would normally be crammed with respiratory tubes could now be allocated to other critical physiological systems. Insects could grow physically larger, extending their linear dimensions and expanding their overall body volume without their internal breathing apparatus suffocating their other organs or taking over their entire anatomy. Furthermore, this hyper-oxygenated influx meant that the fluid-filled tracheoles at the very tips of the breathing network were constantly saturated with metabolic fuel. The direct delivery architecture of the insect body, which bypassed the need for a sluggish circulatory system, suddenly became the most powerful respiratory engine on the planet. Every cell membrane was directly exposed to a continuous, high-pressure stream of pure energy. The internal tissues were bathed in a molecular environment that allowed for instantaneous chemical reactions, completely eliminating the lag times and stamina limitations that plague modern insects. The tracheal system, once a strict anatomical prison, had been transformed by the atmosphere into an open gateway for unprecedented physical expansion. It allowed primitive arthropods to completely ignore the physical boundaries of their own body plans. As the high-pressure air pumped effortlessly through their bodies, it laid the physiological groundwork for an evolutionary explosion, giving these creatures the internal structural freedom needed to pack on pure muscle mass and expand outward into the massive, terrifying forms that would soon dominate the ancient world. With the internal real estate freed from bulky respiratory plumbing and the air saturated to 35% oxygen, the metabolic engines of Carboniferous insects experienced a monumental surge. In animal physiology, the metabolic rate dictates how quickly an organism can convert nutrients into pure kinetic energy, drive cellular repair, and sustain physical work. In a hyperoxygenated world, this rate exploded. The cells were no longer struggling for a tiny share of a sparse gas. Instead, they were inundated with a continuous high-pressure stream of metabolic fuel. This chemical abundance allowed for a massive upscaling of cellular respiration, unlocking an unprecedented level of physical vitality. This elevated metabolic efficiency directly translated into a radical transformation of animal tissue, specifically the development of skeletal muscles. Muscles are incredibly expensive organs to maintain, requiring vast amounts of adenosine triphosphate, the primary energy currency of the cell, to fuel contractions. In the modern world, if an insect grew too large, the innermost fibers of its flight or walking muscles would rapidly outstrip the oxygen supply, building up toxic metabolic byproducts and causing instantaneous fatigue or tissue death. But under the immense partial pressure of the Carboniferous atmosphere, oxygen penetrated directly into the deepest core of every muscle fiber, allowing tissues to maintain continuous high-performance activity without ever suffocating from within. Because the physical limitation of inner tissue suffocation was completely removed, evolution began to pack massive amounts of pure muscle mass onto the insect frame. The flight muscles housed within the thoracic cavities of ancient insects grew dense and heavy, capable of generating immense power. This muscle mass allowed for the movement of large, heavy appendages that would be completely immobile in today's thin air. The cross-sectional area of muscles could expand safely, enabling limbs to grow thicker, longer, and mechanically stronger. Insects were no longer fragile, paper-thin organisms. They became dense, heavy-bodied biological machines capable of delivering powerful bites, sustaining rapid locomotion, and generating massive physical force. This explosion in tissue volume also altered the structural capacity of the digestive and reproductive systems. With higher metabolic rates, the digestive tracts of these creatures could process organic matter with extreme speed, converting nutrients into body mass at an accelerated pace. This rapid nutrient assimilation allowed juvenile insects to grow at a blistering rate, shortening vulnerable developmental stages and allowing them to reach gargantuan adult sizes within a single season. The reproductive organs similarly benefited from the energetic surplus, allowing female insects to produce large volumes of highly resilient eggs, ensuring that the giant lineages could saturate the ecosystem with their offspring. Furthermore, the abundance of oxygen protected these giant bodies from the dangers of oxidative stress that would normally kill a modern organism exposed to hyperoxia. Carboniferous insects developed highly synchronized metabolic feedback loops, using their high physical activity levels to burn off the excess oxygen safely, channeling the chemical energy directly into growth and locomotion, rather than allowing it to form damaging free radicals. The entire organism functioned as a highly optimized furnace, consuming atmospheric fuel at a rate that allowed for the construction of massive solid bodies that remained perfectly healthy at large scales. This physiological revolution completely inverted the rules of the animal kingdom. On the forest floor and in the air, creatures that had once been restricted to the margins of ecosystems due to their small size were now packing en masse that rivaled vertebrates. Their bodies were thick with powerful oxygen-saturated muscle fibers that never grew tired. They could sprint through the undergrowth, tear through tough vegetation, and overpower rivals with brute physical strength. By transforming the internal cellular environment from a zone of scarcity to a landscape of absolute abundance, the 35% oxygen atmosphere allowed tissues and muscles to expand to their absolute physical limits, turning ordinary bugs into the dense muscular brawn that defined the golden age of prehistoric giants. The monumental rise in atmospheric oxygen during the Carboniferous period did not merely alter the internal biochemistry of ancient organisms, it fundamentally transformed the physical mechanics of the air itself. To fully comprehend how giant insects mastered the skies and forest floors, we must analyze the physics of the prehistoric atmosphere, specifically the significant increase in global air density. Air is not weightless. It is a physical fluid composed of gas molecules held against the planet by gravity. When the chemical composition of this fluid shifts dramatically, the overall mass, weight, and density of the atmosphere change with it, creating a completely different physical medium for locomotion. In our modern world, the atmosphere exhibits an average density of roughly 1 2/10 kilograms per cubic meter at sea level, driven by a mixture of 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and trace amounts of other gases. However, during the late Carboniferous period, the atmospheric equation was radically rearranged. While nitrogen levels remained relatively stable, the massive influx of pure oxygen, which peaked at 35%, combined with the high levels of water vapour from the humid global greenhouse, to significantly alter the total atmospheric mass. Because a molecule of oxygen is heavier and more massive than a molecule of nitrogen, replacing a large portion of the lighter nitrogen gas with dense, heavy oxygen caused the overall molecular weight of the air to skyrocket. Furthermore, the total atmospheric pressure at sea level during this epoch was notably higher than it is today. Some geological and aerodynamic models suggest that the total pressure of the Carboniferous atmosphere may have been up to 1 1/3 times greater than modern sea level pressure. When you combine this elevated total pressure with the increased molecular weight of an oxygen-rich gas mixture, the resulting air density becomes extraordinarily high. Estimates indicate that the air during the golden age of giant insects was up to 25 to 30% denser and heavier than the air we breathe in the modern era. To visualize this, walking through the Carboniferous forest would have felt physically different. The air would have possessed a noticeable, tangible thickness. It was a world where the atmosphere behaved much more like a thick fluid than a transparent, weightless void. Every movement of an animal limb, every rustle of a giant fern leaf, and every wave of thermal heat had to push through a heavy, high-density wall of gas molecules. For a modern human, inhaling this air would provide a massive rush of oxygen, but moving through it would require slightly more physical effort due to the increased aerodynamic resistance and drag generated by the heavy molecular matrix surrounding the body. This dense atmospheric fluid exerted a continuous stabilizing pressure over the entire landscape. High air density means that the molecules are packed much closer together, creating a higher molecular frequency per unit of volume. This high-density state had a profound dampening effect on temperature fluctuations, helping to distribute solar heat evenly across the planet and reinforcing the perpetual stable greenhouse climate of the equatorial swamps. It also meant that the kinetic energy of winds and storms was far more powerful, as the heavier air carried significantly more physical momentum when driven by weather fronts across the newly forming supercontinent of Pangaea. For the animal kingdom, and specifically for the pioneers of aerial locomotion, this dense atmosphere changed all the rules of physics and biomechanics. Every equation governing fluid dynamics, resistance, and propulsion is directly dependent on the density of the medium through which an object moves. In thin air, objects fall fast and require immense energy to stay aloft. In thick, dense air, the physical relationship between mass, surface area, and gravity shifts in favor of the organism. By converting the open sky from a thin, vacant space into a thick, supportive fluid cushion, the immense planetary density of the Carboniferous atmosphere provided a unique mechanical landscape. It was a physical environment that was uniquely prepared to support massive biological structures, laying the essential aerodynamic foundation for the evolution of the largest flying creatures the invertebrate world would ever produce. The physics of flight are bound by an elegant mathematical relationship where an aircraft or a biological organism must generate enough upward aerodynamic force to completely counteract the downward pull of gravity. In fluid dynamics, the generation of this upward force is determined by the standard lift equation, which dictates that lift is directly proportional to the density of the fluid medium, the square of the velocity of the wing, the surface area of the wing, and a specific lift coefficient determined by wing shape and angle of attack. During the Carboniferous period, because the global atmosphere was up to 30% denser than it is today. The mechanical variables within this equation were fundamentally optimized in favor of giant biological organisms. This high atmospheric density acted as a massive force multiplier for aerial locomotion. When an insect flaps its wings through a dense fluid, each stroke displaces a significantly higher mass of air molecules per unit of volume compared to a stroke performed in modern thin air. This high molecular concentration means that the wings can push off the air with far greater mechanical efficiency, creating a powerful high-pressure cushion underneath the wing surface and a sharp low-pressure zone above it. As a direct result of this increased fluid resistance, a carboniferous insect could generate the exact same amount of upward lift as a modern insect while using significantly less velocity or a much slower wing beat frequency. For gargantuan flyers like Meganeura, this mechanical advantage solved a massive energetic and structural problem. According to the laws of scaling, as an animal increases in size, its mass grows cubically, while its wing surface area only grows quadratically, meaning large flying organisms naturally become very heavy relative to their wing size. In our modern atmosphere, a dragonfly with a 2.5-foot wingspan would have to beat its wings at a blistering, physically impossible speed just to stay airborne, rapidly exhausting its metabolic reserves and tearing its wing joints apart. But in the thick, soupy air of the Carboniferous, the dense air matrix provided immense natural buoyancy and structural support, allowing these giant creatures to generate massive lift with slow, deliberate and highly energy-efficient wing strokes. Furthermore, this dense air mass drastically reduced the stalling speed of large flying organisms. Stalling occurs when an aircraft or animal flies too slowly to generate enough lift to overcome its weight. Because the Carboniferous air was so dense, giant insects could maintain stable, controlled flight at remarkably low forward velocities. They did not need to sprint or plunge from high trees to launch into the air. Instead, they could effortlessly lift their heavy bodies directly off the ground or from a stationary reed, hovering or gliding through the dense swamp canopy with the graceful agility of a modern bird of prey. The air was thick enough to literally float on, transforming the sky into a supportive highway. This fluid thickness also altered the structural engineering of the insect wing itself. To survive the immense aerodynamic resistance of pushing through a dense atmosphere, the wings of Carboniferous giants evolved advanced structural properties. The fossil record reveals that these ancient titans possessed incredibly intricate patterns of hollow blood-filled structural veins that formed a rigid yet flexible grid across the wing membrane. This specialized venation prevented the large wings from buckling or snapping under the immense fluid forces generated during high-speed maneuvers or sudden aerial braking, allowing the wings to flex dynamically to capture changing air currents. By converting the sky into a thick, high-density fluid cushion, the physical environment of the Carboniferous period completely neutralized the harsh penalties of the square-cube law for flight. Heavy, muscular bodies that would be hopelessly grounded today were easily lifted into the air by expansive, rigid wings that found purchase in the dense atmospheric matrix. This unique intersection of high-pressure physics and biological engineering turned the open air into an ideal hunting ground, allowing the earliest masters of aviation to navigate their humid empire with unparalleled power, stamina, and grace, cementing their role as the undisputed kings of the prehistoric skies. The ultimate manifestation of Carboniferous aerial supremacy was Meganeura, a genus of gargantuan predatory insects that closely resembled modern dragonflies, but operated on a scale never seen before or since. With a wingspan stretching over 2.5 feet, Meganeura stands as one of the largest flying invertebrates in the history of the planet. Moving through the dense equatorial swamps like an apex predator of the skies, this giant aerial titan was not an uncoordinated drifting glider. It was a highly maneuverable, hyper-optimized biological hunting machine that dominated the ancient airspace through a combination of brilliant structural engineering and advanced sensory systems. The primary secret to the flight mechanics of Meganeura lay in the specialized structural architecture of its expansive wings. To endure the immense physical stresses of pushing a heavy muscular body through a dense high-pressure atmosphere, the wings required a perfect balance of rigidity and flexibility. The fossil record reveals that Meganeura possessed an incredibly complex network of structural veins that formed an optimized truss system across the wing membrane. The main longitudinal veins were thick, hollow tubes reinforced with structural proteins, providing an unyielding framework that prevented the wing from buckling during high-speed dives or sudden aerial braking maneuvers. Between these main supports, a dense grid of delicate cross veins distributed mechanical loads evenly across the surface, allowing the wing to flex dynamically to capture shifting aerodynamic currents. This unique wing venation also featured a specialized brace near the leading edge, known as the nodus, which acted as a structural hinge. This allowed the outer half of the wing to twist slightly during the upstroke and downstroke, changing the angle of attack automatically to maximize lift while minimizing drag. Because the thick air provided immense natural resistance, Meganeura did not need to beat its wings with the frantic, energy-draining speed of a modern housefly. Instead, its powerful thoracic muscles drove the interconnected wings in a deep, deliberate, and highly coordinated alternating rhythm, generating massive upward thrust and forward propulsion with remarkable energy efficiency. Equally terrifying to its prehistoric prey was the sophisticated visual apparatus of Meganeura. Like its modern descendants, this ancient titan possessed massive, bulbous compound eyes that covered almost the entirety of its large, mobile head. These eyes were comprised of tens of thousands of individual optical units known as ommatidia, each oriented in a slightly different direction to create a panoramic, near-spherical field of view. This advanced optical array allowed Meganeura to detect the slightest movement in the dark, humid understory of the scale tree forests, giving it an unparalleled ability to spot prey from great distances. Furthermore, the neural processing speed of Meganeura was highly optimized for high-velocity tracking. Its compound eyes could resolve rapid changes in light and motion at a rate that far surpasses the visual capacity of any modern vertebrate, effectively perceiving the world in slow motion. This hyper-acute vision allowed the giant predator to calculate complex interception trajectories through the dense vegetation, targeting primitive flying insects, ancestral cockroaches, and even small land-dwelling amphibians with pinpoint accuracy. Once a target was acquired, Meganeura would plunge through the dense air, using its powerful, spine-covered legs to form a basket-like trap that scooped the victim from the air, cementing its position as the unchallenged tyrant of the Carboniferous sky. While Meganeura dominated the humid skies, the forest floors of the Carboniferous period were ruled by a terrestrial monster of staggering proportions. Arthropleura stands as the largest land-dwelling invertebrate in known Earth history, a colossal relative of modern millipedes and centipedes that reached lengths of up to 8.5 feet and weighed close to 100 pounds. Walking on dozens of pairs of jointed legs, this massive creature moved through the dense, waterlogged understory of the scale tree forests like a biological tank. Its sheer size was a direct testament to the hyper-oxygenated atmosphere and the unique ecological conditions of the ancient world. The primary structural foundation that allowed Arthropleura to maintain such a massive body plan without collapsing under its own weight was its highly specialized exoskeleton. Unlike modern millipedes, which possess relatively thin, brittle cuticles, Arthropleura was protected by an array of heavy overlapping armor plates known as tergites. These plates were composed of chitin heavily reinforced with calcium carbonate and structural proteins, creating a rigid, shell-like carapace that covered its entire dorsal surface. The plates were arranged in a segmented articulation pattern that provided a dual evolutionary advantage, They offered absolute protection against potential predators, while maintaining the lateral flexibility needed to navigate through dense vegetation and tight forest pathways. Each segment of its immense body was anchored to a pair of powerful, muscular legs that extended outward from underneath the protective armour. This wide, multi-legged stance distributed the heavy mass of Arthropleura evenly across the soft, sinking mud of the equatorial swamps, preventing the giant creature from becoming trapped in the wet terrain. The internal musculature driving these limbs was densely packed and highly oxygenated, allowing the animal to maintain a steady, continuous locomotive pace across the forest floor, pushing aside fallen branches and heavy layers of unrotted wood with brute physical force. For decades, the dietary habits of this prehistoric titan were a subject of intense scientific debate among paleontologists, with early researchers wondering if it was a giant venomous predator. However, the discovery of fossilized gut contents and specialized coprolites, combined with detailed analyses of its mouth parts, revealed a very different ecological reality. Arthropleura was primarily a giant detritivore and herbivore, a specialized consumer of the abundant plant matter that littered the floor of the Carboniferous coal swamps. Its massive jaws were designed not for piercing flesh, but for crushing, grinding, and shredding the tough, fibrous wood of scale trees, giant ferns, and ancestral horsetails. Because the microscopic world had not yet evolved the tools to efficiently decompose the massive volume of fallen timber, the forest floor was piled deep with an endless supply of unrotted organic debris. Arthropleura stepped into this wide-open ecological niche, acting as a living shredder that processed the massive botanical accumulation. It used its powerful mandibles to break down the tough lignin-rich plant tissues, extracting nutrients from the inner cells before excreting the processed waste back into the ecosystem. By consuming enormous quantities of vegetation, this herbivorous giant played a critical structural role in clearing pathways through the suffocating undergrowth, cementing its place as the undisputed tank-like architect of the Carboniferous forest floor. Crawling alongside the giant detritivores through the dimly lit understory of the Carboniferous forests was a highly efficient, terrifying carnivore that occupied the apex of the terrestrial predatory hierarchy. Pulmonoscorpius kirktonensis, a species of ancestral scorpion, reached a staggering length of nearly 2.5 feet from its heavy mouth parts to the tip of its venomous stinger. This massive arachnid resembled modern scorpions in its general anatomical blueprint, but its sheer physical scale elevated it into a deadly monster that could easily overpower vertebrates and fellow arthropods alike. Operating in the dense, oxygen-rich air, this giant hunter was a master of ambush tactics and lethal chemical warfare. The primary structural adaptations that allowed Pulmonoscorpius to thrive at such an immense size were directly tied to its advanced sensory and predatory apparatus. Unlike many modern scorpions that have poor eyesight and rely almost entirely on tactile vibrations to locate prey, the fossil evidence indicates that Pulmonoscorpius possessed relatively large, highly developed compound eyes situated on the top of its head, complemented by smaller lateral eyes. This enhanced visual acuity was a crucial adaptation for a diurnal or crepuscular hunter navigating the complex debris-strewn floors of the scale tree forests. It allowed the predator to actively track the movements of swift prey, spot distant targets, and accurately calculate striking distances through the thick, humid air. To secure its prey, Pulmonoscorpius relied on a highly coordinated mechanical and chemical assault. Its frontline weapons were a pair of formidable muscular pedipalps, which terminated in heavy crushing pincers. These claws were designed to snap shut with immense mechanical force, pinning struggling victims instantly and crushing their protective exoskeletons or soft outer tissues. Once a target was securely immobilized by the pincers, Pulmonoscorpius would flex its long segmented tail over its back to deliver a precise, devastating strike with its massive telson, or stinger. the venom apparatus of this Carboniferous titan was highly developed. Given the increased metabolic rates and muscular brawn of its prey, the chemical potency of the venom secreted by Pulmonoscorpius had to be exceptionally strong to ensure a rapid kill. The stinger would inject a highly concentrated cocktail of neurotoxins directly into the circulatory system of the victim. In the warm, hyper-oxygenated atmosphere, this venom would circulate with terrifying speed, rapidly shutting down the nervous system, paralyzing the respiratory mechanisms and liquefying the internal organs of the prey. This chemical efficiency meant that Pulmonoscorpius could safely hunt animals that were close to its own size without risking damage to its own exoskeleton during a prolonged struggle. The predatory menu of Pulmonoscorpius was diverse and far-reaching, highlighting a complete inversion of modern ecological dynamics. It targeted large ancestral cockroaches, primitive land-dwelling insects, and the juvenile forms of giant millipedes. More spectacularly, its size and lethal venom allowed it to actively hunt early tetrapods, including primitive amphibians and lizard-like reptiles that were just beginning to colonize the terrestrial world. These early vertebrates, hampered by primitive lungs and slower metabolisms, were frequently overpowered, stung, and consumed by this armored arachnid brawn. By successfully merging brute physical strength, advanced vision, and a highly toxic chemical arsenal, Pulmonoscorpius reigned as an absolute nightmare of the Carboniferous undergrowth, a true testament to an era when invertebrates held the ultimate power of life and death over the land. The physical and atmospheric conditions of the Carboniferous period provided the fuel and the mechanics for giant insects, but an equally critical factor in their rise to global supremacy was the lack of ecological competition. In the modern world, the sky is a highly dangerous space for any large invertebrate. The moment an insect grows beyond a few centimetres, it becomes a conspicuous high-calorie target for thousands of species of highly evolved, warm-blooded vertebrate predators. Birds, bats, and pterosaurs possess highly sophisticated aerial maneuverability, rapid metabolisms, and active respiratory systems that allow them to easily hunt and suppress insect populations. However, during the Carboniferous period, the open skies were entirely empty of these vertebrate threats, presenting an unprecedented evolutionary vacuum. During this magnificent era of deep time, the animals with backbones were still in their evolutionary infancy on land. The earliest tetrapods, the group that would eventually give rise to amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, had only recently emerged from the water. These early land vertebrates were heavy-bodied, clumsy creatures whose limbs were sprawled outward to the sides rather than positioned directly beneath their torsos. Their skeletons were dense, their muscles were designed for slow, crawling movements, and their brains were small. Most importantly, none of these primitive vertebrates had developed the complex skeletal structures, feathers, or skin membranes required to achieve even the most basic forms of flight or gliding. This meant that for tens of millions of years, the entire aerial realm of the planet was completely devoid of vertebrate life. There were no swooping birds to pluck insects from the air, no nocturnal bats to echolocate through the dark swamp canopy, and no agile flying reptiles to dominate the high forest borders. The sky was an uncontested open frontier, a vast ecological territory waiting to be conquered. The primitive winged insects, which had pioneered the physics of flight long before any other animal group, stepped into this massive structural vacancy with absolute evolutionary freedom. Without the threat of aerial predators, Carboniferous insects did not need to invest their energy into evasive, highly defensive flight patterns or camouflage body styles designed to hide from sharp vertebrate eyes. Instead, they could dedicate their entire evolutionary budget to maximizing their physical size, hunting efficiency, and reproductive volume. A large body size, which would be a fatal disadvantage in a world filled with predatory birds, became an absolute asset in an empty sky. It allowed creatures like Meganeura to fly with immense confidence, transforming them into the apex predators of the air because there was simply nothing larger or faster than them to challenge their rule. This complete absence of top-down vertebrate predation also allowed insects to exploit the heavy, dense atmosphere to its absolute limit. They could grow massive, expansive wings and heavy muscular bodies, knowing that they only needed to outperform or overpower other invertebrates. The sky was not a place of hiding and terror for these arthropods. It was their personal highway system, an expansive hunting ground where they could cruise above the dense undergrowth, locate resources across vast distances, and disperse their populations over entire continents without interference. The evolutionary timeline had granted the insect world an extraordinary head start. By inventing flight first and occupying an empty sky during an era of hypersaturated oxygen, invertebrates became the undisputed kings of aviation. They engineered advanced structural wing trusses and panoramic visual systems that allowed them to navigate the thick, humid air with supreme mastery. For millions of years, the sounds echoing through the giant scale tree forests were not the songs of birds or the cries of flying reptiles, but the deep, resonant and terrifying hum of giant insects, proving that when biology is freed from the pressure of superior competitors, even the humblest lineages can rise to claim absolute mastery over the world. With the skies free of vertebrate competitors and the forest floors teeming with life, the primary driver of evolution during the Carboniferous period shifted from external threats to intense internal competition. In this hyper-oxygenated, resource-rich world, arthropods found themselves locked in a fierce, localized arms race against their own kind. Because the environment could sustain massive amounts of biological tissue, population densities among land-dwelling invertebrates skyrocketed. This high concentration of life created an arena of ruthless predator-prey dynamics, where the ultimate law of survival was simple: grow larger than your neighbor, or become their next meal. Within the dense, humid understory of the coal swamps, internal predatory pressure acted as a massive evolutionary compressor. Primitive arachnids, ancestral centipedes, and early insects were constantly hunting one another through the debris. In an ecosystem dominated by invertebrates, traditional defensive strategies like chemical sprays or camouflage were often ineffective against the highly advanced compound eyes of giant flyers or the sensitive tactile hairs of massive ground hunters. Therefore, physical size became the ultimate mechanism of defense. An arthropod that could rapidly upscale its dimensions through accelerated growth cycles could effectively remove itself from the menu of smaller, contemporary predators. This continuous pressure created a runaway feedback loop of gigantism, where each generation of prey had to grow larger to survive, forcing the predators to scale up in tandem to successfully pierce their armor. This internal escalation fundamentally inverted the natural order we observe in the modern world. Today, insects are almost universally positioned at the base of the terrestrial food chain, serving as a primary food source for a vast array of small mammals, birds and reptiles. But in the Carboniferous period, the sheer physical brawn and predatory efficiency of giant arthropods allowed them to break through this ecological glass ceiling. Instead of being hunted by vertebrates, giant invertebrates became the ones doing the hunting. They stepped into the apex predator niches on land and in the margins of the waterways, transforming primitive vertebrates into easy targets. The early tetrapods of this era, primarily ancestral amphibians and early lizard-like reptiles, were poorly equipped to handle a confrontation with an 8-foot millipede or a 2-foot scorpion. These primitive land dwellers were slow, clumsy, and possessed unoptimized respiratory systems that limited their stamina. When these early amphibians ventured onto the muddy banks of the swamps, they entered a landscape controlled by armored giants. A juvenile amphibian, with its soft, permeable skin and slow reaction times, was entirely defenseless against the crushing, spine-covered pedipalps of Pulmonoscorpius, or the powerful, shredding mandibles of giant predatory centipedes. Even in the air, low-flying vertebrates or those climbing ancient scale trees were vulnerable to the sudden, high-velocity dives of Meganeura, which could pluck small vertebrates directly from branches and consume them with ease. This total ecological reversal turned the Carboniferous wetlands into a world of invertebrate tyranny. Arthropods used their advanced structural armour, hyper-oxygenated muscle systems, and lethal chemical arsenals to dominate every tier of the food web. They were no longer small anomalies hiding under rocks. They were the heavy armour, the swift hunters, and the structural architects of the ecosystem. By weaponizing their size against both their own competitive kin and the emerging lineages of backboned animals, these giant invertebrates established a biological empire where brawn, shell, and mandible dictated the rules of survival, cementing their status as the most formidable and successful conquerors of the deep prehistoric past. The incredible physical expansion of insects during the Carboniferous period allowed them to achieve unprecedented ecological dominance, but their evolutionary journey was constantly governed by an unyielding mathematical law. While the hyper-oxygenated atmosphere completely removed the respiratory limitations that keep modern insects small, it could not alter the fundamental principles of geometry and structural mechanics. Every organism that scales up in size must eventually confront the square-cube law, a mathematical principle originally formulated by Galileo Galilei that describes how the relationship between a physical object's surface area and its total volume changes as its linear dimensions expand. The mathematical core of the square-cube law is simple, yet devastatingly punitive for biological structures. When an organism increases in size by a specific linear factor, its surface area increases by the square of that factor, while its total internal volume and mass increase by the cube of that factor. To visualize this relationship, if a primitive insect doubles its length, its total surface area, including the outer surface of its exoskeleton, will expand by a factor of 4. However, its internal volume, which represents the total mass of its internal tissues, fluid, and muscle weight, will multiply by a factor of 8. If the insect scales up its length by a factor of 10, its surface area increases 100 times, but its total physical weight explodes by a staggering factor of 1,000. For animals that possess a rigid exoskeleton composed of chitin, like insects and other arthropods, this geometric progression introduces a massive engineering crisis. An exoskeleton is a structural shell that encloses the soft internal tissues of the animal, acting simultaneously as a protective armor shield and the primary framework for muscle attachment. The physical strength and load-bearing capacity of a structural tube or a rigid shell are directly proportional to its cross-sectional area, which scales quadratically. This means that as an insect grows larger, its total body mass and weight scale up far faster than the structural strength of its protective chitinous framework. At small body sizes, a chitinous exoskeleton is an absolute marvel of structural engineering. It provides immense mechanical leverage, resists compression forces effortlessly, and easily supports the lightweight internal mass of a small insect. However, as an insect expands toward the massive dimensions seen during the Carboniferous period, the downward pull of gravity acts relentlessly on its cubically expanding weight. Because the weight of the internal tissues increases much faster than the load-bearing cross-sectional area of the exoskeleton legs and body plates, the physical stress applied to the chitinous framework escalates dramatically. If a modern insect were artificially magnified to the size of a human or a small car, without any modifications to its structural materials, its own immense weight would rapidly outstrip the structural integrity of its shell. The downward force of gravity acting on its massive internal mass would create immense structural stress, causing its relatively thin, brittle legs to buckle, crack, and collapse under the pressure. The rigid abdominal plates would bend and break inward, literally crushing the internal organs under the weight of the creature's own armour. Therefore, the physics of materials and geometry place a strict structural limit on how heavy an armoured invertebrate can become before its shell fails completely. To overcome the harsh constraints of the square-cube law and achieve true gigantism, Carboniferous arthropods had to adapt their physical engineering to accommodate their rapidly compounding weight. The fossil record reveals that giants like Arthropleura did not simply grow longer, they completely redesigned their structural architecture. Their exoskeletons became exceptionally thick, dense, and reinforced with mineral compounds like calcium carbonate to enhance their resistance to mechanical compression. Their legs grew shorter, sturdier, and shifted closer underneath their bodies to provide a wide, stable base that could distribute their heavy mass across the muddy floor of the coal swamps. By actively modifying the thickness, material composition, and geometric arrangement of their chitinous shells, these prehistoric titans successfully managed the physical burdens of their own massive bodies, pushing their structural frameworks to the absolute limits of what invertebrate anatomy could possibly endure. Even though Carboniferous insects successfully engineered thicker, mineral-reinforced exoskeletons to survive the structural stress of the square-cube law, they could never escape a fundamental biological necessity that eventually turned into their absolute architectural vulnerability. Because an exoskeleton is a rigid, unyielding outer shell made of hardened chitin, it cannot expand continuously as the animal grows. To increase its physical dimensions, every arthropod must periodically undergo eidesis, the complex physiological process commonly known as molting. During this developmental transition, the organism must shed its old restrictive casing and inflate a new, soft cuticle before it hardens, creating a temporary but catastrophic gap in its structural defences. At a small physical scale, molting is a routine and relatively low-risk biological event. When a modern fruit fly or small beetle sheds its cuticle, its total mass is so negligible that the downward pull of gravity exerts almost no noticeable influence on its shape. The surface tension of its internal fluids and the natural elasticity of its soft tissues are more than enough to maintain its anatomical integrity, while the new shell cures in the open air. However, when an invertebrate scales up its body to the monstrous dimensions of the Carboniferous titans, the physics of molting undergo a terrifying and highly lethal transformation, turning the process into a life-or-death confrontation with planetary gravity. The moment a giant arthropod like Arthropleura or a massive primitive dragonfly began its molt, its underlying epidermal cells would secrete specific enzymes to systematically detach and dissolve the inner layers of the old exoskeleton. The creature would then split the weakened shell open along a predetermined dorsal line and slowly, painstakingly crawl out of its own armoured casing. At this exact instant, the giant animal was completely naked, wrapped only in a paper-thin, incredibly soft and unhardened new cuticle that possessed absolutely zero structural rigidity or load-bearing capacity. For a creature weighing dozens of pounds, this temporary lack of an external skeleton represented an immediate structural emergency. Without a rigid framework to keep its limbs anchored and its body elevated, the immense internal mass of the animal, which had expanded cubically according to geometric laws, was suddenly left entirely unsupported. The remorseless downward pull of gravity would instantly act on the soft, jelly-like tissues. If the giant insect did not remain perfectly flat on a supportive surface or submerged in water, its own immense body weight would crush its internal organs, collapsing its respiratory passages and rupturing internal fluid pathways under the sheer pressure of its unanchored mass. Furthermore, an insect relies entirely on its rigid exoskeleton to provide mechanical leverage for its muscles. Without a hard shell to pull against, the powerful, highly oxygenated muscles of a Carboniferous giant were rendered completely useless during a molt. The animal was left utterly paralyzed, incapable of walking, lifting its head, or defending itself against the smallest adversary. In this vulnerable state, even the dense, heavy air of the Carboniferous greenhouse could not provide enough buoyant lift to prevent a giant soft-shelled flyer from collapsing if it attempted to emerge on a fragile branch, forcing these creatures to find highly stable, secluded environments to undergo their structural transitions. To survive this lethal window of vulnerability, Carboniferous giants had to maximize the efficiency of their molting physiology. They utilized the high metabolic energy granted by the 35% oxygen atmosphere to rapidly pump specialized hemolymph fluid through their bodies, inflating their soft new cuticles to their maximum dimensions before the tanning process could lock them into shape. They also relied on the abundant moisture of the humid equatorial swamps, which kept their exposed tissues from dehydrating, while the outer proteins cross-linked with calcium minerals to form a new, unyielding armor shield. This precarious biological balancing act meant that the very mechanism required for their spectacular growth was also the most dangerous moment of their lives, establishing a definitive, unbreakable ceiling that prevented the invertebrate brawn from ever scaling up to match the size of the massive vertebrate dinosaurs that would follow. The golden age of giant insects, built upon a fragile alliance of planetary geology and atmospheric chemistry, could not endure forever. As the Carboniferous period transitioned into its final epochs, the deep internal mechanisms of the Earth initiated a massive climate shift that shattered the environmental stability of the equatorial world. The continuous continental drift that had originally formed the supercontinent of Pangaea began to rearrange global oceanic currents and wind patterns, dragging large portions of the southern land masses directly over the South Pole. This major geographical realignment triggered a severe, planet-wide cooling trend, plunging the Earth into a prolonged ice age that brought a sudden end to the perpetual greenhouse era. As the southern polar regions became locked beneath massive, expanding ice sheets, global sea levels began to drop precipitously. Water that had previously flooded the low-lying basins of the equator was systematically drawn out and trapped as solid ice at the poles. This global drainage had an immediate and catastrophic impact on the vast equatorial wetlands. The shallow warm seas that had insulated the coastal lowlands receded, leaving the permanently waterlogged basins high and dry. Within a relatively short geological time span, the endless labyrinth of coal swamps lost its primary source of moisture, initiating a profound ecological crisis known to science as the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. Without the continuous daily rainfall and high water tables driven by the ancient greenhouse effect, the structural framework of the equatorial forest dissolved. The giant-scale trees, which relied on shallow root systems anchored in saturated mud, could not survive in dry, hardened soil. Millions of square miles of dense vegetation began to wither and die, transforming the once continuous green empire that stretched across continents into isolated pockets of vegetation. The immense botanical canopy that had blanketed the equator for tens of millions of years fractured, leaving behind a scarred, fragmented landscape separated by arid valleys and dry savannas. This severe fragmentation tore the highly specialized habitats of the giant arthropods apart. An ecosystem that had functioned as a singular interconnected biological engine was broken into tiny, isolated ecological islands. For giant organisms that required vast territories to forage for nutrients or hunt prey, this sudden reduction in habitat size was a devastating blow. The dense corridors of humidity that had protected giant insects from environmental stress vanished, replacing the comforting, moist air of the global sauna with harsh seasonal cycles, unpredictable droughts, and fluctuating temperatures that their ancient bodies were poorly equipped to handle. Furthermore, the destruction of the continuous forest canopy disrupted the local transpiration loops that had generated the region's heavy rainfall. As the density of the vegetation decreased, the land lost its ability to retain moisture, accelerating a feedback loop of regional desertification. The endless piles of unrotted wood on the forest floor which had accumulated during the damp peak of the Carboniferous period were suddenly exposed to dry air and shifting winds. The environment was transforming from a stable, hyper-productive nursery into a harsh, divided landscape where only the most adaptable and resilient organisms could hope to survive. marking the beginning of the end for the rule of the armoured giants. While the physical landscape was fracturing due to tectonic shifts and expanding polar ice, a microscopic revolution was quietly taking place on the forest floor that would permanently dismantle the chemical foundation of the giant insect empire. For tens of millions of years, the planetary ecosystem had been locked in a massive chemical imbalance because primitive microorganisms lacked the biochemical tools to break down lignin, the tough organic polymer that gave giant trees their structural rigidity. This evolutionary lag had allowed unrotted wood to pile up in massive compressed layers, trapping carbon underground and causing atmospheric oxygen levels to soar to 35%. However, this massive bottleneck in the global carbon cycle could not last forever, as life eventually found a way to bridge the biochemical divide. The ultimate breakthrough came from the kingdom of fungi. Through a series of major genetic mutations and intense evolutionary pressure, specific lineages of ancestral wood-decaying organisms, the precursors to modern white-rot fungi, successfully engineered a revolutionary suite of extracellular enzymes known as lignin peroxidases. These advanced enzymes possessed the unique chemical ability to utilize oxygen chemistry to aggressively attack and break apart the complex, highly stable and irregular aromatic rings that form the molecular matrix of lignin. With the synthesis of these powerful biological keys, the indestructible armour of the ancient scale trees and giant club mosses was finally shattered, allowing microorganisms to access the rich storehouses of cellulose locked deep within the fallen timber. The consequences of this microscopic innovation were immediate and globally transformative. Across the fragmented remnants of the equatorial forests, the massive accumulations of dead wood that had remained pristine and unrotted for eons began to decay rapidly. The fallen logs, stumps and branches were systematically reduced to soft, crumbly mulch as the newly evolved fungi spread across the globe. This sudden restoration of the global decomposition loop completely rewrote the chemical balance of the planet. As billions of tons of ancient biomass were finally broken down, the process consumed vast amounts of oxygen from the surrounding air, while simultaneously releasing an enormous, continuous torrent of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. This massive chemical rebalancing acted as a sudden brake on the planetary oxygen factory. The primary mechanism that had originally allowed oxygen to accumulate to dangerous hyper-oxic levels, the permanent burial of unrotted carbon, was now completely gone. Instead of being locked away safely under layers of mud to form coal, carbon was now recombining with atmospheric oxygen through fungal respiration, reversing the chemical trend that had defined the entire Carboniferous period. Within a relatively short geological interval, the atmospheric concentration of oxygen began to slide downward from its majestic 35% peak, plummeting toward modern levels. This severe drop in oxygen levels struck at the absolute heart of the giant insect world. The entire physiological framework of the arthropod titans, their decentralized tracheal breathing networks, their massive muscle mass, and their hyper-accelerated metabolic rates, had been custom-built to exploit an atmosphere saturated with oxygen. As the air grew thinner and less chemically volatile, the immense partial pressure that had effortlessly driven gas molecules deep into the bodies of massive insects vanished. The microscopic revolution on the forest floor had effectively severed the life support system of the ancient giants, proving that the ultimate fate of Earth's largest invertebrates was ultimately decided not by giant cataclysms, but by the quiet, relentless evolution of a single microscopic enzyme. As the atmospheric oxygen levels plummeted from their historic 35% peak toward 21%, the giant insects of the Carboniferous period faced an inescapable, invisible catastrophe. The rapid drop in oxygen concentration completely reversed the physical laws that had previously acted as an absolute superpower for arthropod anatomy. For millions of years, these creatures had relied on intense atmospheric partial pressure to drive gas molecules deep into their bodies through passive diffusion. However, As the air grew thinner and less chemically volatile, the steep concentration gradient driving oxygen down their respiratory networks flattened entirely, triggering a massive planet-wide biological suffocation. The primary structural flaw that doomed these ancient titans lay within the very design of their long, decentralized tracheal systems. Unlike vertebrates that possess active muscular lungs to mechanically pump fresh air deep into internal tissues, insects remain dependent on a network of static tubes connected to external spiracles. In a hyper-oxygenated atmosphere, oxygen could easily travel long distances through these pathways before losing its kinetic momentum. But in a depleted atmosphere, the rate of passive molecular diffusion dropped drastically according to Fick's laws. The air travelling through the long, winding tracheal passages lost its oxygen content almost immediately near the external entry points, leaving the innermost sections of the tubes filled with stale, useless gas. This geometric limitation transformed the sprawling, respiratory networks of giant insects into absolute death traps. For a gargantuan flyer like Meganeura, or a massive ground dweller like Arthropleura, the internal pathways required to reach their core muscles and vital organs spanned several inches. As the ambient oxygen concentration fell, the partial pressure was no longer high enough to force the gas to the deep ends of these elongated tubes. The innermost cellular layers, which were located furthest from the external spiracles, were completely cut off from their metabolic fuel supply. The deep tissues began to experience acute, irreversible hypoxia, essentially causing the giant animals to systematically suffocate from the inside out, while breathing normal air. To make matters worse, the massive, dense muscle mass that these giants had packed onto their frames during the Golden Age now became a catastrophic energetic liability. Large muscles demand enormous volumes of adenosine triphosphate to maintain structural integrity and function. Without a high-pressure stream of oxygen to fuel their elevated metabolic rates, these heavy muscle fibers rapidly accumulated toxic metabolic waste products and underwent cellular failure. The powerful flight muscles of giant dragonflies could no longer generate the immense physical brawn required to beat their expansive wings against gravity, and the heavy armoured limbs of giant ground arthropods grew too weak to support their massive, cubically expanded body weights. Unlike smaller insects, which could adapt to the changing atmosphere by dedicating a slightly larger percentage of their internal volume to wider tracheal tubes, the Carboniferous giants had already pushed their physical dimensions to the absolute geometric limit. Their internal cavities were already tightly packed with a delicate balance of organs, muscles, and digestive structures. They had zero structural real estate left to spare for expanding their respiratory plumbing. If their tracheal tubes grew any wider or more numerous to compensate for the thin air, they would have to completely crowd out their own digestive tracts and reproductive systems, making survival impossible. Caught in this brutal anatomical bottleneck, the giants had no evolutionary escape route. Generation after generation, as the global atmosphere continued its relentless chemical decline, the maximum viable size for an animal relying on passive tracheal diffusion shrank dramatically. The giant lineages could no longer sustain their monstrous proportions through juvenile development, and the adult forms were systematically starved of energy during critical life events such as molting or hunting. The era of invertebrate brawn was utterly crushed by a quiet, invisible wave of biological suffocation, proving that when an organism's internal engineering is custom-built for an environment of absolute abundance, it cannot survive a sudden shift toward global scarcity. The biological suffocation of the arthropod titans did not happen in an ecological vacuum. As the hyper-oxygenated atmosphere of the Carboniferous period collapsed, it paved the way for an extraordinary changing of the guard. The very same environmental shift that turned the long, tracheal systems of giant insects into dead zones became the ultimate catalyst for a different lineage of animals. Vertebrates, which had spent millions of years lingering as slow, clumsy creatures in the shadows of the armoured giants, were finally poised to unleash their own evolutionary superpower, an active, centralized respiratory system driven by lungs. This anatomical divergence fundamentally reshaped the balance of power on Earth. While insects relied on passive gas diffusion through static tubes, primitive reptiles and ancestral amphibians possessed a centralized chest cavity that could actively, mechanically, pump air in and out of the body. As the global oxygen concentration dropped toward modern levels, this active pumping mechanism allowed vertebrates to maintain a highly efficient concentration gradient across their respiratory membranes. They did not have to wait for oxygen molecules to slowly drift through microscopic pathways. Their muscles physically expanded and contracted their thoracic cavities, forcing fresh air directly into highly vascularized lungs where oxygen dissolved into a high-pressure bloodstream. This active circulatory network, driven by a powerful heart and packed with hemoglobin, could transport respiratory gases over immense distances without losing momentum. It completely shattered the geometric constraints that trapped insects under the square cube law. Vertebrates could scale up their body volume to massive proportions because their blood vessels could grow infinitely longer, branching actively into every newly developed muscle mass and organ system. As the Permian period succeeded the Carboniferous, these early reptiles rapidly diversified, packing on pure bone and muscle brawn that easily eclipsed the size of any terrestrial arthropod. The true coup de grace, however, occurred in the open skies. During the late Carboniferous, insects had enjoyed a complete monopoly on aerial locomotion because the air was entirely empty of vertebrate threats. But as the atmosphere changed and early reptiles mastered the land, a branch of highly advanced archosaurs began to look toward the air, eventually giving rise to the majestic pterosaurs. These were not primitive drifting gliders. They were highly sophisticated, warm-blooded master aviators that possessed a revolutionary respiratory architecture consisting of high-efficiency lungs coupled with an intricate system of internal air sacs, mimicking the hyper-optimized breathing systems of modern birds. This advanced vertebrate breathing system allowed pterosaurs to extract maximum energy from a lower oxygen atmosphere, sustaining a blazing metabolic rate that fueled continuous, high-performance powered flight. With their wide, leathery wing membranes stretching over hollow, lightweight bones, these new masters of aviation achieved an unmatched level of speed, range, and aerial maneuverability. The sky, which had once been a safe, peaceful highway for giant insects like Meganeura, was transformed into a deadly hunting ground. Against these fast, sharp-eyed vertebrate predators, any remaining large insect stood absolutely zero chance of survival. A large, slow-moving arthropod was an incredibly high-calorie, conspicuous target that could easily be spotted from great distances and intercepted in mid-air or plucked directly from scale tree branches. Insects could no longer afford to be large and heavy. Their evolutionary strategy had to pivot completely from brute physical brawn to extreme minimization, speed, evasion, and concealment. The active lung had definitively defeated the passive trachea on both the land and in the air, permanently wresting control of the planet away from the invertebrate world and establishing a new world order dominated by backboned animals. For millions of years, the monstrous proportions of Carboniferous arthropods remained locked in the deep geological past, surviving only as spectacular impressions within the fossil record. However, in the modern era, evolutionary biologists and respiratory physiologists have stepped out of the field and into the laboratory to test the validity of the hyperoxic hypothesis. By utilizing advanced environmental chambers, contemporary scientists have successfully recreated the atmospheric conditions of the ancient world, forcing modern insects to live, develop, and reproduce within simulated environments saturated with high levels of pure oxygen. The results of these pioneering multi-generational experiments have been nothing short of extraordinary, providing concrete empirical proof for the physical laws that governed deep time. In various university laboratories, researchers placed populations of standard fruit flies, large beetles, and modern dragonflies into hyperoxic chambers, engineered to maintain an atmosphere containing up to 35% oxygen, perfectly mirroring the chemical profile of the late Carboniferous period. Over several generations, the insects subjected to this high-pressure chemical environment underwent rapid, measurable morphological transformations that astonished the scientific community. The most conspicuous anatomical change observed was a significant increase in overall body size. Within just a few generations, the insects reared under hyperoxic conditions began to grow substantially larger than their control group counterparts living in normal 21% air. Fruit flies expanded their linear dimensions, and beetles packed on additional mass, demonstrating that the abundance of metabolic fuel acts as an immediate catalyst for physical growth. The high partial pressure of oxygen allowed individual cells to divide more rapidly and enabled juvenile larvae to assimilate nutrients at an accelerated rate, pushing their biological boundaries closer to the gigantism seen in their ancient ancestors. Even more profound than the external changes were the internal structural reconfigurations revealed by advanced microcomputed tomography scans. When scientists peeked inside the bodies of these hyperoxic test subjects, they discovered a radical anatomical adjustment within the respiratory network. Because the surrounding air was saturated with an absolute abundance of oxygen, the insects no longer needed a massive, sprawling network of wide internal piping to satisfy their basic metabolic demands. In response to the chemical surplus, the internal tracheal tubes actually grew significantly narrower, shorter, and less dense throughout the body. This reduction in the volume of the breathing tubes provided direct confirmation of the geometric theories surrounding the square cube law. By shrinking the internal real estate dedicated to gas transport, the modern laboratory insects effectively freed up massive amounts of internal space within their thoracic and abdominal cavities. This newly available structural volume was immediately reallocated to other physiological systems, allowing for the development of larger reproductive organs and more dense, powerful skeletal muscle groups without crowding out the digestive tract. These modern laboratory experiments have effectively turned back the evolutionary clock, demonstrating that the relationship between atmospheric composition and insect body plan is an immediate dynamic law of nature. The research proves that modern insects still carry the latent genetic architecture of their ancient Carboniferous ancestors, waiting for the right environmental key to unlock their physical constraints. By showing that a simple increase in oxygen can simultaneously trigger external growth and shrink internal breathing tubes, modern science has validated the ancient history of the Earth, proving that the titans of the coal swamps were not biological anomalies, but the predictable structural consequence of a planet operating at absolute chemical maximums. The profound results of modern laboratory hyperoxic experiments naturally invite an intriguing, speculative leap into the far future of our planet. If a simple shift in atmospheric chemistry can alter the internal anatomy and external scale of modern insects within a few generations, it raises a compelling scientific hypothesis. Could the giant arthropods of the Carboniferous period genuinely return to dominate the Earth if global atmospheric conditions were to change once again? To answer this question, we must look beyond science fiction and evaluate the complex interplay of long-term geological cycles, evolutionary genetics, and modern ecological realities. From a purely chemical and physiological standpoint, the basic biological engine required for insect gigantism remains entirely viable. As seen in controlled laboratory settings, the genetic blueprints of modern arthropods have not completely forgotten their ancient past. They still possess the developmental plasticity to upscale their body dimensions and reconfigure their internal tracheal networks when provided with a surplus of oxygen. If a massive globe-spanning geological event, such as an unprecedented bind-buster of photosynthetic plant growth or a total cessation of organic decomposition, were to drive global oxygen levels back up to 35%, the strict physical barriers of the square cube law would immediately begin to lift, allowing the insect body plan to expand outward once more. However, a return to the Carboniferous era would face a massive, highly dangerous structural obstacle that did not exist 300 million years ago: the presence of highly evolved, warm-blooded vertebrate competitors. When ancient insects first scaled up into giants, the skies were entirely empty, and the land was populated only by slow, clumsy, primitive amphibians. Today, the modern world is completely dominated by birds, bats, mammals, and reptiles that possess highly efficient, active lung-driven respiratory systems and incredibly advanced neurological processing power. In a hypothetical high-oxygen future, these vertebrates would also benefit immensely from the chemical surplus. Mammals and birds would experience a massive surge in their own metabolic rates, stamina, and muscular brawn, making them even faster and more lethal hunters than they are today. A giant, slow-growing insect larvae, or a massive, clumsy, soft-shelled dragonfly emerging from a molt would represent an incredibly high-calorie, easily targeted meal for sharp-eyed predatory birds or highly agile mammalian carnivores. To survive this intense top-down predatory pressure, evolving insects could not simply grow into lumbering, slow-moving giants like Arthropleura. They would be forced to maintain high levels of speed, maneuverability, and advanced camouflage. Therefore, if giant insects were to return, they would likely look and behave very differently than their Carboniferous ancestors. Instead of slow, exposed titans, evolution under intense vertebrate competition would favour highly specialised, hyper-aggressive and armour-plated monsters that occupy niche environments where vertebrates struggle to compete, such as dense subterranean cavern systems or highly toxic deep swamp thickets. While the laws of physics and chemistry would technically allow for the resurrection of invertebrate giants, the unyielding rules of ecological warfare ensure that the future of Earth will never be a perfect carbon copy of its past, proving that the wheel of evolution always rolls forward into entirely new and unpredictable biological territory. The spectacular rise and fall of the giant insects of the Carboniferous period offers a profound evolutionary lesson about the delicate, unyielding relationship between an organism's body plan and the chemistry of its environment. We often view physical size as an absolute metric of biological success, assuming that bigger is always better in the endless struggle for survival. However, deep time teaches us that gigantism is not an inherent evolutionary destination. It is a highly specialized structural response to a specific atmospheric window. When the planet provided an absolute surplus of oxygen and a dense physical atmosphere, the passive tracheal network became a master key to global dominance. But the moment those environmental conditions shifted, that very same anatomy transformed into a fatal, suffocating burden. Body size is completely bound by the laws of physics and geology. Ultimately, the true conquerors of nature are not those that achieve the most monstrous proportions, but those that maintain the highest degree of structural adaptability. When the hyper-oxygenated greenhouse collapsed, it was the minimized, lightweight, and highly agile insect lineages that survived the transition, sliding into the cracks of a changing world to become the most diverse and abundant group of animals on Earth today. They traded raw physical brawn for structural efficiency, ensuring their long-term survival in a world that had moved on from giants. Thank you so much for joining us on this immersive scientific journey into the deep history of our planet. If you found this deep dive into prehistoric biology and atmospheric physics fascinating, please take a moment to click the like button and subscribe to the channel for more detailed explorations of evolutionary history. We love hearing from our community, so please leave a comment down below sharing your thoughts on these ancient titans, and remember to let us know exactly where and when you're watching this video from around the world. Your support helps us continue to unlock the grand mysteries of deep time. Until next time, keep looking closer at the world around you, because even the smallest creature beneath your feet carries a history that once shook the entire planet.